Have you ever felt like your dreams of the ultimate off-road adventure were being weighed down? And I mean literally weighed down. Picture this. You've meticulously crafted your Jeep Gladiator into the ultimate overland camping machine, possibly spending thousands on it, only to find your suspension sagging under the weight of all of those recent upgrades. And you're left wondering, how do I reclaim that perfect level stance without busting my budget? With a Jeep, your first thought is usually to install a lift, and well, that is an expensive proposition. Well, today I'm diving into my solution for this problem, which is these Airlift 1000 adjustable air springs. And I've installed these on my prior vehicle. If you go back and look on my channel, my minivan camper, and these things work wonders on keeping a weighed down vehicle level. And so I was super excited to find out that they actually make them for the Jeep Gladiator. For about 130 bucks on Amazon, I bought these adjustable air springs to see if they can restore my Jeep Gladiator's stock ride height with about 600 pounds of gear in it. Before installing any gear in the bed of my Jeep, I measured the original ride height from the bottom of the fender to the ground, and it came out to about 40 inches. And now that I've added about 660 pounds of gear, I'm sitting at 37.5 inches. So from my perspective, since adding all of that gear, I've lost about 2.5 inches of ground clearance, at least for the chassis. The pumpkin height on the rear differential is still about the same, but the chassis is lowered by that 2.5 inches. So to find out if this Airlift 1000 adjustable air spring suspension kit can restore my ride height to either the 40 inches or close to the 40 inches, I'm gonna pull off my table, get this thing unboxed, and get it installed. So there's actually not a whole lot inside of this box. You've got the 2 airbags, the hose, the bushings that go on top of the airbags, and your Schrader valve kit. In addition to all of that stuff, you do have a few zip ties that you'll probably need when you route your hoses to make sure that they're not rattling around. And then finally, you have a catalog, instruction manual, and a sticker. And if I didn't mention already, this thing is made in the USA, and it's been manufactured in the United States since about 1949. So before I get this thing installed, I just want to look in here and see if I think I can actually get the bags installed without raising the vehicle. The vehicle already has quite a bit of ground clearance. I think it's like 11 inches from the pumpkin to the ground. And I can see the gap in the first spring is almost 4 inches. So to get the airbags to install, I'm not gonna lift the vehicle up. I'm also not gonna disconnect any of the suspension, just like you might see in the Airlift brand installation video. They honestly make it seem a little more complicated than it is. All I'm gonna do is push all this air out of the airbag, get it nice and cinched down, and then put this little lid back on it. Let's see if I can do that. And that's good enough. That's gonna be just enough clearance to get that to wedge into the spring. So it's possible that that doesn't work, but I'm gonna try it anyway before I jack it up. It'll make my job about 20 minutes easier. And I am gonna put this black bushing in with the crown facing up, and let's see, does it just slide? Yeah, that slides right in, so not super complicated. However, I know there is an isolator, like a rubber isolator, up in the top here, and in the installation instructions, they do recommend that you pull that out. I will be able to get it out, but probably not from this angle. So at this point, I've pulled the black isolator out. I'm just gonna see if I can slide this in. Oh, lost my little hole, my cover there, so that's not good. I'm gonna try to just work this in with that out, at least to get it started. And once I get it started, I'll put it back in. But all I wanna do is clear this. Let's see if I can clear it. I'm just pushing that up and in, and I can bend it a little bit. It's very pliable, it's very flexible. And again, my goal here on this side is just to see if I can get it in without using my jack stand. Okay, so I definitely got it in there, but now I might not have enough room for that isolator. Let's see if I can get that rubber bushing in there without needing to pull this back out. Because, let's see, because it is getting kind of tight. So We'll go in here, let's see. Ooh. So it's times like right now where I sometimes question why I make some of the decisions I make. I'm gonna go ahead and get my jack out, my jack stands, get this thing lifted up and see if it's any easier, because yes, I got the red bag in, but now I'm struggling with getting the spacer back on top of it. So easy lesson learned. I've got the thing jacked up, at least on one side. I've got jack stand under it, and that freed up a ton of space. So now you can see I've got plenty of room to mess around with this bag. Yes, it's not fully inflated, but when I find the isolator that I just dropped, I'll be able to pull that out, get this thing in there, and got plenty of room to work now. Now I'm just gonna feed my black hose in. Once I get my black hose fed, I'm gonna put it on the bag and just add a little bit of air pressure to it just to get the bag to inflate in this position. Before you actually connect your hose, make sure you have one of these hose clamps securely installed about 1 inch deep onto the hose. That way when you get the hose installed, you can close it up and make sure it has a good tight seal. There it is right there, ready to go. Now I've got my hose securely fastened to the airbag. I'm going to go ahead and feed the excess back up. That way when I inflate it, everything's in the proper position, nice and straight. Instead of messing around with this, I've seen a lot of videos where folks go around and they mess around with it. I just loosely installed the Schrader valve, and my son here helped me pump a couple of PSI into it. That way I could get the thing fully inflated or fully into the correct shape without attaching the Schrader valve completely. So now the airbag is in the correct position on this side. I've got my hose currently loosely mounted. I'm going to fix that up later. And now let's move over to the other side. So same thing, I've got the jack stand, and I'm going to empty out this bag just a little bit so I can feed it through that hole and do the same exact process on the driver's side. So to get these in, I had to like twist them just a little bit, you know. So now I've got the passenger side on, and what I want to do is, per the instructions, pull this rubber isolator off. So I pulled the first one off, and the reason we're pulling those off is so that they don't interfere with the new rubber block. And that thing is dirty up there. I've got the hose routed for the driver's side and passenger side. And now I'm about to start with the T intersection. Before I put this on, I do have a clamp on my hose, and this T adapter is pretty thick compared to the hose. So it does take a little bit of pushing and a little bit of forcing to make sure that you get it on. But the good thing is I feel like even without the clamps, once you get it on, it's not gonna leak at all. So I'm almost done. I've got my last backside hose that I need to attach. So I've got my T installed, and now I'm just gonna run my last hose out to the bumper of the vehicle. So I've got my T hose connected, and I'm running that through this cross member on the actual bed above the frame, and then I'm going to run it even further and possibly through that little hole right there out to the back bumper. And if that works, then this will be a perfect job and a perfect install. And besides messing around with the camera and starting without a jack, which I shouldn't have done, this would have been an easy 1 hour job, maybe 2 hours, but really just a 1 hour solid job. So now I've run this hose up around the front of the spare tire, over this fake bumper that comes on the Rubicon model, and then through this little hole right here. And I'm going to use that little hole because it's pretty solid. I'm going to just give myself some excess hose so that I can reach with my bicycle pump if I need to, and then cut it, and then when I'm not using it, I can tuck the hose back up in there out of the way. And so while this might not be the ideal way to mount this, it'll allow me to have the hose out and away from the vehicle to hook up a bicycle pump if I don't want to use like an air compressor, and then just tuck that up out of the way. And if you look here, it's tucked up out of the way and it's not really coming down on its own. So let's see how that works out. I feel like this is about plenty of hose right there. That'll be enough to reach with a air compressor or with a bike pump if I want to. All I have left to do now is install the Presta valve. And as usual, before I do anything with this job with these hoses, I am going to install that little clamp so that when I get my Presta valve on, which I'm going to go ahead and lick it, that way it's able to move so I can get a good seal that I need. And for me, that's about it. Now all I got to do is move the clamp onto the brass fitting. Boom. And so there it is. Got my clamp on my brass fitting, and I'm ready to just feed that hose back in. So it's not going to sit like this when I get it all dialed in, but right now I'm just going to add some air. I want to go ahead and add the 35 psi. I do have all the pressure off of the suspension. The vehicle is down in its regular position, so the jack and the jack stand are gone, but I want to add that 35 psi. And in fact, I'm just going to go up to 20 first. I want to go to 20 and see, hey, does 20 psi, which is about half of the limit, does it actually level the vehicle out, or do I have to go all the way to that 35? Now I've got 20 psi. Before I move the vehicle, I'm going to go ahead and feed this hose back up out of the way. And just so you guys are aware, the exhaust is on the opposite side of the vehicle, so I'm not worried about anything overly hot melting this hose from this side. Now I wanted to check, just in case, how much hose would be exposed if it all came down. And that's it right there. So I don't foresee that it's going to be sagging or hanging there, but I know it's there. When I want to grab it, I can grab it, and otherwise it's up out of the way safely. So I've got everything set up the way I want it. I've got 20 psi, and I can tell just by looking at it that it is pretty much lifted with only the 20 psi in it. But what I want to do before I call it settled and measure it is just drive around a little bit, get some motion in the springs so that the airbags will settle in their position. That way I'll get a fair reading after a few minutes of driving. So while I'm out here in the field, let me tell you a few options for hooking up the air hoses. The first option for me, which is the easiest, is to tee those off and hook them up. That's what I decided to do. However, if you want a little more control of each of the individual airbags, then you could hook up the airbags individually, and the kit does come with 2 Schrader valves that you can hook up to each side. In addition to that, they do have a couple of other options through the Airlift company. One of them is Extreme, with a compressor and a little gauge that you put under your dash, and that gauge, or with that gauge, you can control your air pressure without ever having to get under the vehicle again. You know, if I had all the money in the world, I would definitely get that one, and I would use that because then I would never have to get out of the vehicle or use a pump to pump it up. The second one is you do have some gauges you can use, and then you still use the pump, but with either the individual or the double setup that I mentioned previously, you can have the gauges so that you can see, so 1 gauge for the single line setup or 2 gauges for the double line setup, and you can actually see what the pressure is inside of each of those airbags using those gauges. So those are a couple of options. Let's drive this thing around a little more so those springs can get fully broken in, and then we'll measure it. So I did not have to drive very far, and I can already feel that the vehicle is basically leveled out. That's only with the 20 psi. So let's get it parked and let's see how much of that 2.5 inches of rear end loss did I get back. So we're basically back where we began the video. The only 2 differences are I'm a whole lot dirtier, and it really looks like the rear end of the Jeep is a lot higher. And before I measure the ride height, do me a favor and please consider subscribing. So with 20 psi in the tires, I'm at 38 3/4 inches. So I've gained about 1.25 inches back. Now I'm going to go ahead and bump it back up to that 35 and see with the 35 psi if I can get even closer to that OEM ride height. So here I am at maximum psi. And let's see what we got. Maximum PSI, just under 39 inches. So I think for me, these airbags are gonna essentially max out at 38.5 to 39 inches. Because going up to 35 PSI didn't really raise the vehicle anymore, I'm gonna go ahead and drop it back down to that 20 or so. In fact, I'm just gonna watch it. I'm gonna lower it until I see this thing starting to sag. That will be, to me, basically an ideal amount of pressure for these air shocks. So this isn't the most accurate way of measuring the PSI, but let me go ahead and hook this up. I'm actually only at about 15, so I'm gonna level it back off at about 20. 18 PSI, that gives me plenty of flex, plenty of room for these airbags to move around, and I think I'm gonna call this job done. So if you enjoyed my content, if you like watching me install stuff, or if you like my off-road adventures, please consider subscribing. And now watch this video to check out my recent install of my new bumper.